Welcome to this section on security and compliance. We're going to start right away with the shared responsibility model. So this is something we've seen all along this course, but now it is time for us to formally introduce it. So AWS responsibility is the security of the cloud. That means that all the infrastructure that they provide to you, that includes the hardware, the software, facilities, networking, they have to protect it, because this infrastructure will run all the services that you are using on AWS. On top of it, any service that is managed by AWS, such as S3, DynamoDB, RDS, is the responsibility of AWS. But once they provide a service to you, then how you use that service is your responsibility. So for example, as a customer, you are responsible for the security in the cloud. So in the instance of an EC2 instance, your customer, so you, is responsible for the management of all the operating systems. That includes patching the operating system and making updates to it. You must configure the firewall, so that means that you must configure, for example, the network ACL and the security group. And also you need to make sure that your EC2 instance has the correct IAM permissions through the use of IAM instance role. Then we also need to ensure that we encrypt the application data accordingly to our compliance requirements. Then there are some controls that are shared. For example, patch management, configuration management, awareness, and training are both shared between you and AWS. For example, for patch management, if you're using something like RDS, then AWS will do the patch management for us. And if we're using something like EC2, then we have to patch our operating system, so the shared control is here. For example, for awareness and training, AWS has to train their employees to use their facilities correctly and to make sure they adhere to their security guidelines. And you have to make sure to train your employees correctly to use the cloud, and doing this training is one of these ways, obviously. Next, let's look at a detailed technology, for example. So for RDS, the responsibility of AWS is to manage the underlying EC2 instance and to disable SSH access, to automate the database patching, to automate the operating system patching, and to audit the underlying instance and disk to guarantee that it functions over time. Your responsibility as a user of RDS is to check that the ports, IP, security groups, inbound rules in your database security group are set up correctly. It's also to make sure that the in-database user creation and the permission of these users is done the way you want. And also, you need to make sure that if you want to create a database with or without public access, and if you wanted to configure the database, you could use parameter groups, for example, to force only encrypted connections. Finally, if you wanted to encrypt the data within the database, it is again your responsibility to enable. Next, for Amazon S3, the responsibility of AWS is to guarantee you to get unlimited storage, to guarantee you to get encryption when you enable it, and to ensure the separation of data between all the different customers of AWS. As well, they need to make sure that all the employees of AWS cannot access your data. Your responsibility is to configure your bucket the way you want, to make sure the bucket policy adheres to your standards, and also to use IAM users and roles accordingly. And finally, if you want to encrypt the data, it is your responsibility to enable it and to use the encryption scheme that works for you. So hopefully that makes sense. Here is a diagram from the website of AWS, which shows the responsibility in the cloud is the customer, and the responsibility of the cloud is for AWS. So as a customer, your data, the applications, the platform, identity and access management is up to you. Operating system, network, and firewall configuration as well. Then your client-side data encryption, your server-side encryption, and your network traffic protection is all yours. AWS, instead, is responsible for their software, so their services, also making sure that the compute, storage, database, and networking are working correctly when they provide it to you. And they're responsible for their hardware and the global infrastructure, so the regions, the AZ, and the edge locations. Hopefully that makes sense, because the shared responsibility comes up at least 2 to 3 questions in your exam. So understanding what is your responsibility and what is the responsibility of AWS is very important. I hope that was helpful, and I will see you in the next lecture.